Hi, I'm Mattea Roach. Welcome to Bookends. David A. Robertson is a name that can be found on a lot of books in classrooms and libraries across Canada. And David A. Robertson, the man himself, has physically been in a lot of libraries and classrooms across this country. Through his books and in-person engagements, David has dedicated his career to sharing stories about Indigenous peoples, their histories, their cultures, and their lives today. With each of his stories, David delves into hard truths, always with a gentle touch and a profound sense of hope. And now David has a new book out. It's called 52 Ways to Reconcile: How to Walk with Indigenous Peoples on the Path to Healing. Regardless of how long your family has been in this country or what your relationship is to this land, I think there'll be something you can take away from this book and from this conversation. And it was such a delight having David A. Robertson join me in studio for this chat. How are you doing?
Doing well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
To start things off, I wanted to actually read the epigraph of 52 Ways to Reconcile, and it's a quotation from the 19th century American author, historian, and minister Edward Everett Hale. And you used as your epigraph, "I am only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something, and because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do something that I can do." What do those words mean to you?
Well, they mean a lot to me. One of the many things that I learned from my father, actually. Father's been a big mentor to me. He continues to be, even after his death. He kept copious notebooks, my dad. So everything he learned or thought about or liked hearing, he wrote it down. And he would often paste in quotes that he liked into the inside covers of these notebooks. The last one he kept had this quote by Edward Everett Hale in it. And it meant so much to me that I actually got it tattooed on my arm too, but in syllabics. But what it says to me is that, first of all, I think that no action is too small. Any action you take with intention can have a profound impact. But if you don't do anything, then you're not giving yourself a chance to have that impact. And so I think it's a call to action for me. It reminds me that I can do whatever is in my capacity to do with the platform that I have. And even if it's just one thing, it's better than doing nothing.
Mm. That's so much at the heart of this new book, given that it is a book where it's giving suggestions essentially of actions that any person can take to walk along the path to reconciliation. I think reconciliation entered the vocabulary for a lot of people when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established back in 2008. But that wasn't the first time, of course, the word reconciliation was used to talk about Indigenous peoples and their relationship with Canada. What does the word reconciliation mean to you? Because you talk about that a bit in the opening to this new book.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, because I've been doing this for about 15 years now, and I've been lucky enough to go to schools across Canada to speak to teachers, adults all over the place. And as I've done this work, I've come to a better understanding of what we're trying to do. I do think that reconciliation, in the broad sense that people think about it in, is a misnomer, because we're not trying to return to anything. We're not trying to fix something that was not broken before. The relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canada has always been broken. So it's not exactly the right word, I don't think. I use it, but I just want people to think critically about everything. Mm-hmm. And so we think critically about this word. What I think we're trying to do, and what I think that reconciliation really is, what I talked about with my father about, is it's building relationships. It's building community. And it's doing that through mutual understanding and respect. So we're not trying to build or return to anything. We're trying to build something for the first time. And so if we keep that in mind, I don't care what you call it, as long as we're doing things properly and with the right kind of vision. And I think that conversation hopefully focuses that vision onto the right kind of goals we need to have.
Mm. You write that you see reconciliation as a verb, which is kind of interesting because reconciliation as a noun almost sounds like it's a state that you get to and then you're there, whereas a verb implies to me that it's ongoing action that doesn't end. Can you talk a bit more about that, reconciliation as a verb?
Yeah, I mean, it is an action is intentionality. We need to continue to think about the actions that we can take in our own capacities and have a long-term view and know that we need to continue to act into the future. My dad used to say that, I'll probably mention my dad every single answer I give, but that if he did things the right way, that he won't see the results of the actions that he's taken in his lifetime. I was given this amazing reminder of that when after he died, I was giving a PD session to Indigenous teachers at the Canadian Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg. And after the session I was giving to these teachers, my dad worked in Indigenous education. They all came up to me and told me that they were there. A lot of them were there because of my dad. And I saw what he meant there, and so I wish he was there to see that, but he knew he didn't have to be. He wouldn't be if he did things the right way. So it's a continual action, and keeping in mind as well that we're still trying not only to heal from what's happened, but we'll be trying to heal from what is happening now for a long time. We still have colonial systems in this country that is doing damage, and that means that the clock hasn't started ticking yet to when we need to start healing as a whole. The foster care system, the education system, justice, all of these systems are still in place that are doing harm. And so we have a long road to go, and a lot of actions need to be taken and will need to be taken for the foreseeable future. So if we take them with intentionality and with the knowledge that we all do have a role and we all can take an action and we should take an action, that's when we change this word into a verb. And that verb is a motivational factor for us to continue to do the work together as a community.
It's funny you mentioned, bringing up your dad in every response, and he's everywhere in your work as well. I'm a famous talker about my dad, that I will weasel my dad into any conversation, so I can relate to that absolutely. And I want to give you the chance to talk about your dad in more detail, because his ideas and your relationship with him are all over 52 Ways to Reconcile, and he is such a part of the work that you do in your speaking and community engagement. Can you tell us what it is about him that continues to inspire you in your work? And, what was it that brought all of these people to the Canadian Human Rights Museum? Like that you mentioned, he's had such an impact, not just on you, but on so many people, it sounds like.
Well, the stuff that my dad was talking about and working at, 30, 40 years ago were things that we still aren't doing. And so he was a very forward-thinking man. He was a visionary. He worked in Indigenous education. He built programming. And the programming he built was put in place so that Indigenous communities in particular will have control over their own systems. He talked a lot about local control, for example, in the education system, and how kids should be able to learn in their homes, taught by their own people, or by people who had been trained properly to stand in front of kids and speak in their language and know their worldview. He thought that Cree kids, for example, deserved no less than French kids who were in French immersion. Then why don't we have Cree immersion programming? And so he was someone who shaped what I do, because I try to have the same sort of vision that he's had, knowing that the things that he wanted to do, the things that he wanted to accomplish, were forward-thinking things. And in that Human Rights Museum experience, he developed programming in particular to train Indigenous people to teach in their own communities. So he had this program called BUNTEP, which is the Brandon University Northern Teachers Education Program. He built that in the 70s. It's still running today.
Wow.
Out of University College of the North, which he implemented that college. And he would never take credit for that. That's the other thing, the humility that he had with what he accomplished was something I also try to emulate in my own work. We don't do the same work, but I think we have the same goals,
Yeah. In terms of the work that you do, I mean, you're a storyteller, you are an author, you're going into schools and communities to engage with the public and share really from the heart about a lot of these issues that we've been discussing. You say that stories are at the heart of reconciliation. Can you talk about why that is for you?
Well, I just feel that, when we talk about reconciliation, it's inexorably linked with truth. Mm-hmm. So you can't get healing whatever way you want to talk about it without truth. And the truth lies in the stories that we tell. My dad and I used to talk about reconciliation as this conversation. It's not a one-way conversation. It's us, like what we're doing now, sitting across a table and talking to each other and like listening, really listening to each other and working to understand each other and come to a respect through understanding. That's what it is. And then through that, see two things. One of them is that we're all people. We share the human condition. And the other thing is that the things that set us apart, the differences, make us stronger as a community. And there's a teaching of non-interference in the Cree culture, and that is that you don't interfere with how someone else lives. You try to model a good life through how you live. I think that's a really good way to go about anything. Mm-hmm. I think on this journey, it's a good way to go about it too. So that's kind of my approach to reconciliation, is having that conversation. And I think that's what I've seen borne out of the work that I've done in the schools and conferences and readings and whatever I've been able to do in my career.
I'm interested to talk about, some of your earlier books. Like, you started out actually working in graphic novels. You have the 7 Generations graphic novel series that you started back in 2010, or a graphic novel about the life of Helen Betty Osborne. I love graphic novels. I am a big proponent of graphic novels as a serious form of literature and something that can teach us so much. Why did you choose graphic novels or comics to start off your writing career?
It's really fighting fire with fire, When I was a kid growing up, I was a huge comic nerd, probably still am. And I used to read comics by the box. My brother and I used to stay up all night. My brother Mike and I, we used to stay up all night reading comics by flashlight under our blankets. And what I didn't know at the time, but what was really seeping into my being, were these misrepresentations of Indigenous people, these stereotypes through Indigenous characters in comics, and how it created a view of what an Indigenous person is, and a completely damaging view. And so when I started to think about writing about Indigenous people from a place of knowledge, after doing the work for several decades, I thought I would use comics because comics had done so much damage. So why not use them to do good? And so I used them early on in my career to accurately represent Indigenous peoples and the many different distinct cultures we have across Turtle Island. And it's been this incredible journey where I go to schools now and I still see those books I wrote 15 years ago being used in classrooms. The 7 Generations is getting a 15-year release in the fall because it's still relevant. And that means so much to me to see that book still has use in the classroom to teach. But it's because of, I think, the content, but the form. And comics speaks so powerfully to us because it's how we used to talk. We used to talk through pictures before we had words. And so there's so many reasons why it works so well. But I think one of the main reasons is because we want to flip things around and do good with things that used to hurt us.
I'm interested, you mentioned being a comics reader growing up, and certainly that anecdote of reading books under the covers with a flashlight is something that I think probably a lot of our listeners can relate to as bookish people. I know that you grew up not totally connected to your Cree identity and kind of learned that you had Cree family and connections with that community a bit later in your childhood. I'm curious about the interplay of having maybe picked up some negative stereotypes and inaccurate representations through reading. Like, how did that interact with you learning about your Cree identity a bit later on in your childhood?
Well, what you do initially is you build this really kind of shaky foundation with these lies, really. And you become those lies. You believe that you're those lies. And so I believed that I was those stereotypes. I looked at myself and thought, the only thing accurate about, comics representation of Indigenous people, if you think about it, think about like the leather pants and the war bonnet and the shield and spear and all that. The only thing that's accurate is that we all have like ripped six packs. That's all. No, but really, like you begin to think of yourself that way, and you begin to think of yourself as the lazy Indian or the drunken Indian or the savage Indian, and it does damage to your psyche. It does damage to how you see yourself, and you begin to, at least for me, develop a low sense of self-esteem. And on that foundation, it becomes more solid as you grow older, and there's nothing in opposition to that. When my father and my mother got back together when I was in high school, and my dad, I was really got to know my dad for the first time because he started to live with us. And he started to tell me stories about his life growing up on the trap line, life in the community. I got to see what he did, go to his work, and he was the boss. And I was like, oh man, how is this Cree guy? He's in charge of a bunch of people. Like he's the boss, And so the process is you break apart that foundation. You take a jackhammer to it. You destroy that foundation. And then you build up something new. Mm-hmm. And you build up something new based on truth that comes through story. And so it's this long process. And over time, in that rebuilding process, I began to develop a strong sense of identity and a strong sense of self-confidence as a Cree person because of the work that I did. And we can't get there if we don't have access to the stories that we need to build up that foundation based in truth. And everybody needs that. Everybody deserves that.
Just a note that this next portion of our conversation deals with the topic of residential schools. If you're in need of support, you can reach out to 1-866-925-4419. Your first picture book was When We Were Alone, and you and your illustrator, Julie Flett, actually won a Governor General's Literary Award in 2017 for that book. When you look back at writing that book and the process of bringing it out into the world, what was that period of working on it like for you?
It was eye-opening because, I always had an attitude in my work that we can do anything we want with stories. It's just that we haven't done it yet. If we don't think it can be done, it's because we haven't tried it yet. When We Were Alone was a kind of a bold story because after reading the calls to action from the TRC, it said we need to start teaching this stuff in kindergarten and all the way through school. And I remember thinking to myself, what is there for kindergartners right now? And what support are we giving teachers to teach something that's super important? And I've always believed that we need to start teaching these things at a very young age, just like we do any other subject. I use this analogy of math often. We don't wait till grade 8 to start teaching math. We start teaching in kindergarten. We need to do the same thing with residential school history. So I sat down one day and I started writing When We Were Alone. And it was a script that had balance, which my dad always talked about. We need to have balance. So not just the trauma. Let's talk about the reclamation. And so I tried to balance the story in that way. But at the same time, there's some really hard truths in there. And I've always believed, and I learned this from Maurice Sendak, you can write anything for children. They're smart. They actually are more engaged readers than adults are. They dig, And so I've never worried about writing subject for children. I worried about the language I use, the age appropriateness of the language. When We Were Alone came out, I remember there was resistance at first because they were like, you can't write about residential schools for kindergartners. And I said, this is because we haven't done it yet. I've always had that attitude. And so When We Were Alone came out, and I've never heard once a negative comment about it. And I've heard many stories about the impact that it's had on kids, but through the parents, And so I remember one time very early on in the life of When We Were Alone, at a grade 1 classroom, the teacher was telling me a story about how a parent had come up to them after school one day and said, "What did you read to my kid?" And the teacher thought, "Oh, I'm in trouble," And she said, "Well, I read them When We Were Alone," showed them the book. And the parent said, "Well, I'd never learned about residential schools before, and my kid taught me last night because they'd read this book." And so what we're doing is we're arming children with truth. And children will do incredible things with that truth. And they really are the agents of change. They're the ones who have the heavy work. We've left them with this burden. And the best thing that we can do, because we've done that, is to prepare them to undo the damage that we've done. And they're ready for it. And I'm really grateful to be able to talk to tens of thousands of kids a year. And it's incredible what I see. And that's why I have so much hope in the future, because of the future is in their hands. And it's in good hands.
Yeah, I would love to hear more because, again, you mentioned you visit tens of thousands of kids and share directly these stories with them. What sorts of responses and engagement do you get when you're sharing these stories and, again, these difficult truths about residential schools with kids? Because certainly I can think back to, I graduated high school 2015. I think my residential school education was insets in the Canadian history textbook in high school. We definitely didn't get anything about it in elementary school, for sure not.
You wouldn't have, no. Yeah. It's remarkable, what kids are learning today. I go to schools, and the one I do with every assembly, every classroom I speak to, I ask them who here has learned about residential schools, and everybody always puts their hands up from kindergarten all the way to grade 12. we've done incredible work in making sure that children know the history and are learning the history all through their schooling experience. And the kids who are learning these things are doing things with that knowledge, which is the important thing. Learning about it is meaningless if we don't take action based on that knowledge. So kids are actually out there actively taking action to follow through with the knowledge that they've accrued through stories, through teachers in the classroom. There's a story I often tell about this girl named Willa, and it was around the time when the unmarked graves were being reported across Canada, starting in Kamloops, and we were on our way to a march on Canada Day that year. We're on our way there, and my wife was looking at this Instagram post about this girl, Willa, who had started a lemonade stand to raise money for residential school survivors. We went to go get lemonade, and there was a lineup of people who were wanting to get lemonade. And the next day, we found out that she'd raised over $1,000 that she donated to the Indian Residential School Survivor Society and the Mama Bear Clan in Winnipeg. And if one 9-year-old kid, is capable of doing that, anybody's capable of doing anything. And that's an example. And I see kids do stuff like that all the time. And so that's the thing, reconciliation it cannot happen without accompanying action. And that's why I wrote this book. It's just some ideas, every week for a year, just to do something. Every little thing we do gets us closer to where we need to be.
Mm. David, I want to ask actually about another children's book that you wrote, which is your other collaboration with Julie Flett on the Trapline. You won another Governor General's Literary Award for that in 2021, just absolutely stacking up awards. You mentioned this trapline earlier, actually, when you were talking about your dad near Norway House in Manitoba, where your father would have spent his early years. And it inspired not just this book on the trapline, but also your podcast, Kiweo. Can you describe this actual place and what it means to you?
Well, it's another home. Mm-hmm. We have this saying in Cree culture, I think in many different Indigenous cultures, it's called blood memory. And it's a concept where the people who came before you live within you. They're kind of woven into the fabric of who you are and your identity. And so I went to the trapline with my father the year before he died, and we got to walk the land together. And he taught me stories, and that was important. I learned about his life there and what he did. But he also, when he brought me there, I felt like I had come home too. He hadn't been there for 72 years, and I had never been there before, but I felt like I was being welcomed there by the land. It was this really powerful feeling. My dad also seemed younger. He was frail and getting older at the time, but he seemed stronger that day. I remember thinking, he's drawing strength from the land. My dad is strong here because of the water in the land. And it was a profound day, and it really not only shaped my life in a different way, but it changed the course of my work as well. Because what I realized is that this is equally important. Learning about stuff like this is equally important. And it reframed reconciliation for me into knowing that it's not just about trauma, it's also about the beauty of our peoples, across Turtle Island, our cultures, our communities, our connection to land, our languages. And learning about those things is equally important as the trauma that we've endured as a people. And that's why I appreciate so much being asked to go to schools, because kids get to see me. Mm. I always ask them, what did you think you were going to get when I came here? Did you expect to get this dude in jeans and a t-shirt with tattoos and a Pearl Jam hat? But that's Cree too, And so it reframes this perception of Indigenous people, not only into who we are, but what we can do, what we're capable of. And I think that's such an important part of this conversation.
Mm. David, I'm curious, we've talked a lot about the work that you've done in schools and the presence that a lot of your books have in schools, but I also know that your books have been challenged or rejected in a number of school boards across this country. What has that been like as an author, to have your work be contested, and why did people contest these works? Well,
there's a lot of reasons. I think that the easiest way to kind of explain that is to say that there is a fear of the unknown. There's people who grew up, people who are my age probably, are a little older, a little younger, grew up without any knowledge about residential schools, about Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples. And it's not ignorance that is a fault of anybody's, but ignorance is a lack of knowledge. And so in that lack of knowledge, we see that there's a fear of the truth. And there's a misconception in that truth of maybe blame or guilt being placed on people, maybe. And I should have mentioned too, like, even though a lot of books that are banned are from marginalized groups, the vast majority are from the LGBTQI2S community by far. And that is also a fear of the unknown. What we need to do as a whole with book bannings is to make sure that people have the right to challenge literature. What I want people to think more about is what are we protecting here? Mm-hmm. Do we need to be protecting kids from literature? Or do we need to be protecting literature from ignorance, right? Banning a book does not negate the fact that we live in a community with the LGBTQI2S community. They're still here. Mm-hmm. They're a vibrant part of our community. It doesn't erase them. What it means is that we have kids who grew up with this indoctrinated view of what that community looks like without the access to knowledge, with truth, with stories written by and about the people who are from that community. Mm. That's so vitally important. And so policies that address book bannings and challenges, they need to, first of all, protect the books. Kids don't need protection. I've met enough of them to know that. In that area, they don't need protection. Books need protection. They also need to require people who challenge books to have read the books, because the vast majority of people who are challenging books haven't even read them. It's truth. Mm-hmm. So people need to read the books. They should be required to read the whole book before challenging them. If you did that, book challenges are going to go down, like I would say 90%. There would be so much fewer book challenges. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. But books need to be in the hands of kids. That's the bottom line. If they aren't, then we're setting ourselves back, and that hurts us all. Mm.
I want to ask actually about another book that you're publishing in 2025. You have been wildly prolific. Like I cannot believe how much work you managed to get done. Earlier this year, you released your second memoir called All the Little Monsters: How I Learned to Live with Anxiety. Very raw and honest book, but somehow also gentle. How and when did mental health issues become a big part of your work?
Well, I think they were always a part of my work in a way. It's funny, I wrote 7 Generations, 2010. That's when it came out. I was telling my publisher, Catherine Gervasi from Highwater Press, just when this book came out, I was talking about, my progression in my career and talking about mental health advocacy. And I was like, well, I didn't start really talking about mental health, writing about it till like maybe this series called The Reckoner and this book called Strangers. And she's like, no, Dave, you wrote about it in 7 Generations. And, Edwin is someone who has suicidal ideations based on the historical trauma that his family has been through. And I thought about it and I said, oh, you're right. I've been writing about it since 2010. And the progression of my career in mental health advocacy started in 2010. I used characters as a proxy for my own struggles, though. It wasn't something I talked about in my own experience. There was a shame associated with what I was going through. I didn't want people to know how badly I was struggling, and people didn't. Mm. When I started to read these books and talk about these books in classes, I almost always had kids come to me and talk to me about their struggles. And at a certain point, I thought, I'm being a little disingenuous here. I need to talk about what I'm going through too. And group therapy helped me to realize that as well, that talking about it doesn't only help yourself, it helps other people too. So I started to talk about it a little more, and then eventually got invited to a panel in Calgary with Sheila Rogers and Alicia Elliott and Sarah Leavitt. And I had a panic attack before that event, and I told people I was having a panic attack because at that point I was like, I'm going to tell everybody everything. Yeah. This is like there's no secrets for me in the mental health world. So I told everybody I was having a panic attack, and it opened up the room, and I just realized it's something I really need to make as much a focus in my life as reconciliation in mental health advocacy. So since that time, I've talked about it extensively. I've learned about it. I'm by no means an expert. I'm an expert in experience, but writing about it was the culmination of, I think, a work that's lasted 15 years. And it was a way for me to really bring it out in the open so people not only knew what I was going through, but hopefully would give them safety and comfort in what they were going through and help them to speak about their own struggles. Because the starting point of healing and mental health is asking for help. You can't ask for help unless you're talking about what you're going through. I think that's an important part of sharing, is it gives other people permission to talk about their own struggles. So that's what I've tried to do in my own life as a mental health advocate.
How are you feeling like mental health wise now? I know it's such a non-linear journey of dealing with one's own mental health, talking about it. Where do you sit right now mental health wise, if you don't mind me asking?
It's a day-to-day thing. There's some days where I wake up and I feel like I don't want to go to bed. And some days I wake up and I'm feeling okay. In the fall, I was in a really bad place. I didn't think, there were some days I didn't think I'd be around the next day. And the tools that I've been able to put in my toolbox over the course of my life have helped me to deal with those days more effectively now, where I can get out of bed. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's a heroic act to get out of bed. It's courageous. Anybody who does something that they don't believe that they can do, that these, I call them the monsters, but whatever you call them, are telling you that what you can't do, what you are, what you can't be. If you do it anyway, and if you're the person that they tell you can't be anyway, that courageous act, I think, is part of the healing journey. And so there's good days and bad days. But as you go forward in your life, even though I don't think those things will ever be gone, you have much more good days than bad days. And I think that's a meaningful thing to see in your life. And it helps other people see that they can do it too.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that mental health was showing up in your work before you started explicitly and consciously writing about it. And it showed up in a lot of your work where you're sort of explaining and exploring the relationship between, for instance, mental health and intergenerational trauma faced by Indigenous communities. How do you see your work with mental health connecting with the work that you do on reconciliation?
Well, I mean, I think like mental health is a huge issue in our communities. And so you want to look at the real meaning of reconciliation. That's what we need to do in our communities as Indigenous peoples. We need to return to a right relationship with ourselves, within our families, within our communities. We need to do that work. People are struggling because they have had this trauma passed down to them, or because they're living in a community that is remote and they're isolated and they feel like there's no access and they feel lonely. And that loneliness can lead to depression, So mental health is, I think, really strongly linked to the reconciliation. It is an epidemic in Canada. We in our communities, we're still struggling, and we need access to supports to work through the things that we never asked for, but we have. And the least that can be done is to give us the opportunity to heal in good ways.
David, I want to ask now actually about another book for young people that you have coming out this summer, which is Little Shoes, illustrated by Mary McKibben. The illustrations are so beautiful. They just glow off the page. And at the end of this book, you have a photo of your son, James, who's sitting beside a memorial, the titular Little Shoes, I suppose, a memorial to children that did not come home from residential schools. What role did James have in developing this story?
A huge role. He's such a thoughtful, compassionate, empathetic kid. Most kids are. And we were at a memorial after the unmarked graves, and James, on his own, went over to this memorial with all these little shoes and teddy bears, and he sat there and looked at them. And he sat there for probably 5-10 minutes. And we took a picture of him, not in a performative way, but we just wanted to remember that moment because he was working through, he was trying to understand. And then pretty soon after that, he came into our bedroom and he went up to my wife and he said, "Who cuddled the kids at night when they were scared?" And my wife and I tried to answer that the best we could. And then he kind of crawled into bed with us. And I thought, oh man, kids are going to have so many questions. And so many kids are going to be asking stuff like that. And how do we answer that properly? And how do we prepare ourselves to answer those things properly? And just like with When We Were Alone, I just thought, books help. So I felt like I needed to sit down and write something that would help a parent, that would help a teacher answer those tough questions that kids are going to have because they feel so much and because they know so much. But they're still kids. And this book is a way for me to maybe just start a conversation and at least get kids and adults thinking about how to work through the things that are really hard to understand. Like, how could a system be in place that killed kids? Because that's what this system did, And kids deserve to know these things. And how do you do it in a good way without scaring them? And how do you do it so that they understand without being afraid? And this book was a way for me to do that. But James was the catalyst.
Yeah, I think one thing that I've heard kind of in response to questions about what age is the right age to start talking about residential schools and how do we talk about this with children is like, well, if kids who were 5 years old were being taken to residential schools and they had to contend with the reality of what that was, surely we can find ways to talk about it with kids of that age now. Your work writing for children has overlapped with your work raising not just James, but actually 5 kids, which is quite a bundle of children. How much of your kids influenced your work over the past 15 years?
Oh, enormous. Yeah, enormous influence. I have a 22-year-old, 19-year-old, 17-year-old, 14-year-old, and 10-year-old. And they were probably the primary influence in me starting to write for kids for a few reasons. I wanted them to understand the country. I wanted them to understand the history, and through that understand a bit more about themselves without imposing anything on them. But I also wanted them to understand as well that we live in a community. Wherever you are, you're part of a community. And you not only should be able to benefit from living in that community, if you're lucky enough to live in a good community, but you should contribute to that community in some way to make it better. And what if we all did that? And if you do that, you're making your community a little bit better every little act you take.
Well, David, thank you so much for coming into the studio today and for sharing so openly and giving so much of your time. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
That was David A. Robertson. His new book is called 52 Ways to Reconcile. And as David suggested, supporting Indigenous creators and sharing their stories is one of the small acts that we can take on the path to healing. Our friends over at CBC Gem have curated an amazing collection of shows, movies, and documentaries to help you dive into Indigenous culture and stories. You can search up the Indigenous Stories collection on CBC Gem. This episode was produced by Sarah Cooper. Ailey Yamamoto is our associate producer. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. A huge shout out to our audio tech, Aronde Williams, and to everyone on the CBC Books team. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.